Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Maria Maszczorska and you are watching SE's Art Series, where we meet with artists, gallery owners, art historians, and overall art people discussing their journeys, inspirations, everyday practices, challenges, and more. And today my guest is an inspiring artist from Philippines, Loribelle Spirovski. Loribelle had a passion for drawing since she was a little kid, scrapping various drawings in her notebook. Many years later, growing into internationally known abstract artist, working with various mediums and inspiring us to see known in a new ways. I cannot wait to dive into discussion with Loribelle, but before we will, as per always, I'll please ask you to click the like button, subscribe, and now enjoy. I remember from your written interview, you were saying you loved to work with a scrapbook as a kid, and then you went to
Mm,
art school and started off as an art teacher, and then made a transition to an artist. So I was curious, how did that happen?
really interesting story. So I basically wanted to be a teacher because I thought you can't make money as an artist. So I wanted to be practical about it. When it came time to actually doing the sort of teacher training where you had to go to schools, I found that it was a lot harder than I thought. Long story short, I decided, okay, I'm not going to be a teacher. What am I going to do with myself? So I started painting because my partner at the time said, "Why don't you paint? You're very depressed. You should paint something to make yourself feel better," which I did. I kind of enjoyed it. I guess I enjoyed it, and it was the best, most stimulating challenge, which is so strange coming out of an art degree. You think that I would have had plenty of experience painting, but the culture of my university was such that the focus was on conceptual development rather than technical technical skill. I actually really didn't learn how to paint at school. Yeah, so I had to very slowly teach myself how to paint when I graduated, but it ended up being the most freeing way of approaching painting because I had no expectations really. I could just freely do trial and error by myself and take my time and in the meantime, I was working as an English tutor, which is how I was earning money. But the transition gradually happened where I was tutoring less and painting more and getting commissions here and sort of selling a painting here and there. And that's kind of how I gradually shifted from being an English tutor to being a full-time artist.
That's such an incredible story. So when you were saying you were teaching yourself, like developing a concept, how to paint, like where, like, did you know which books you have to go for, or like you had a sense of what kind of like style you like to paint? How did you find the medium that you work on right now?
No books at all. I probably should have done that. I think I just looked at a lot of paintings, both in person, just in galleries, and on the internet. I especially became obsessed with Francis Bacon.
Hmm.
And because I had never seen any paintings by Bacon, and I initially really didn't like his work because they terrified me and it was too dark and confronting for me. But I don't know how it is that I became obsessed. I think I started watching David Lynch and then he talked about how Francis Bacon was an influence on his work. And then I tried to deconstruct Bacon's paintings without having ever seen a Bacon painting. Like I didn't realize that he painted on raw canvas, for instance, as opposed to primed canvas. And so I had to figure out all these ways of like, how did he get that effect? It was really more just seeing paintings that I liked and trying to deconstruct them and trying to like reverse engineer and trying different ways. And that was where the fun came from because there wasn't a teacher sort of looking over my shoulder saying, "You're not doing it right." I could just do it and there were no risks. There was nothing to lose. So it was very freeing and yeah.
You were like in this creative flow. I do remember a moment where you actually thought about yourself, be like, wow, I'm an artist, like I'm a professional artist. Do you remember that moment when it happened?
It's a big, strangely big question for me because I actually didn't start calling myself an artist until 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, because I was calling myself a painter. So I was thinking about how I guess I was still trying to master the skill of painting. And I thought to be an artist, like I would make art, but that was incidental. What I was doing was painting. I felt more like a crafts person. And
Mhm.
I think that's just to do with my background, kind of my family background. They were sort of, we're workers, we're worker bees. And so I felt more comfortable calling myself by a trade, by a craft. In a way, I thought it was arrogant to sort of presume that I was an artist, which feels like such a hallowed position. You know what I mean? Like to call myself a philosopher or a poet, you know what I mean? Which people do, of course. But I only really fully internalized it, I think, during the pandemic when I realized how much I relied on art making for survival, not just in a financial sense, but existentially. That
Hmm.
when it was taken away from me, because we had to temporarily move house during that period, and it was very isolating, of course, for everyone. And then shortly after, I became injured. So there was sort of this long period of not being able to paint. And I just suffered hugely. So that's when I realized, yeah, okay, I can't lie to myself anymore. I am an artist. This is what I live and breathe for.
Wow. So you sort of found like your oxygen in a way, like in the art. And it's so interesting how in the like it has this beauty in it. How did you find this beauty through these dark times?
I think part of it is I'm thinking in terms of memes now. Part of it is like there's this meme about like when you I'll totally destroy, but basically I want to be this like edgy, angsty, dark. Like all my favorite artists are quite dark. Their subject matter is very dark. But I'm a very bubbly, bubbly, like light person. So I think I can't help but make like pretty work. And I'm like, I don't want it to be pretty. I want it to be really dark and really confronting and scary and all of this. I think it's just my natural sort of lightness as a person that comes out. But I also freak myself out sometimes with sort of what comes out where I think like, oh, well, okay, probably need to see my therapist again. But yeah, I think the one rule that I always follow for myself is that I want to paint something that I would hang on my own wall. I want to paint something that I want to keep looking at. And that always requires an element of complexity and darkness, because I get bored by things that are just pretty and attractive. I need something, to
Perfect.
sink my teeth into. Yes, exactly, which makes it more interesting and perfect to me, at
That
least.
makes total sense. So how does your work like day in the studio looks like? Because it seems like it's a curvy journey in a sense, right?
Totally. It depends. And my routine has changed a lot because of this injury that I mentioned. I used to think you should start early in the morning, by 9, 10 o'clock, be in the studio, start and, have a lunch break, have a dinner break, whatever, but then stay for hours and hours and hours in the studio.
Mhm.
But I realized that my peak times for working are actually like 1 p.m., 2 p.m. onwards.
Okay.
So I actually go about my day and do sort of household things in the morning and get that side of my life done. And then I go into the studio and I feel like I've let all that go and I can really be in artist mode from that
Mhm.
point on. Really in terms of generating ideas, a lot of that happens outside of the studio for me. It happens when I'm reading a book that is completely different to ideas that I'm thinking about. It's happening when I'm on social media or I'm walking, doing grocery shopping and I'll see something and it kind of just, sparks an idea. Constantly taking photos and screenshots and things. And by the time I get to my studio, I already have a plan for at least 5 different paintings, and they're usually in 5 different directions. So depending on how familiar you are with my work, I work in very different styles. So I don't have just the one mode that I work in. And yeah, the reason why I got injured partly was because I overused my arm, and I like to have three or four paintings going at the same time in 4 different styles. So it's
Wow.
like a like an ADHD sort of method of working, I think, because I get sort of
Genius. There's no
bored with one, I
way.
do another.
So you work in the same time on like 4 or 5 works. And talking about
Exactly.
right? I mean, and talking about inspiration, like, do you have this, I know, practices or something where you like, you feel like you need this like shot of inspiration? Like, what do you do? Where do you go? Is it like museum, nature? How do you approach that state?
And this is something that's changed over time because when my career just started, I think I was just overflowing with stories to tell. I think it was more a matter of keeping up with what my brain was thinking about. So I had to learn to paint very fast because I was like, oh, before I lose that thread, I need to capture it, I need to put it onto canvas, which is why I was often working on five different things at the same time. But now that I'm sort of in my mid-career, it's more about standing back. I've done all of this experimenting and I know what I like, what I don't like, what I can do, what I'm less good at, what my strengths are. It's more about taking a step back and really seeing what the underlying meaning is underneath all of that experimentation. And my inspiration at the moment comes from really everyday things. So I take so many photos, and a lot of my paintings are of my husband, Simon. And really, it's going to sound so weird, but the thing that inspires me the most is light. Just how light hits certain objects, certain people, certain spaces. If I'm in a room and I can see a certain lighting, in a way, I almost think about it like a theater set designer, where I'm thinking, how are we staging this set piece? And I'm thinking of costumes. I'm thinking of roles and narratives that are around the place. A lot of my inspiration comes from film, again with the lighting sort of aspect and character roles and things. You never know what will inspire you until you actually give it time to breathe.
No, it does. I think it sounds a lot like meditation when you're trying to abstract from your thoughts and just focus on the thing for whatever it is and how the light falls and the object. But I really love that you touched on your husband, Simon, because I remember this
Yes.
incredibly inspiring story of how you guys, in a way, met after many years when you were.
Yeah.
I was like, don't you mind sharing this part? Because
Of course, yeah. So in year 12, so in high school, in my final year, you have to do a massive creative art piece, a major artwork. And I initially was big into collage. So my main sort of medium was collage and sculpture, weirdly. So I had this big plan to do these crazy sort of paper sculptures. And my teacher's like, that's actually really hard to grade. It's very hard to mark and it doesn't really fit into any category. So I was like, all right. So she said, why don't you try portraiture? And I'd never really painted at that point. So I was like, I'm gonna paint. I've never painted before, I'll paint. And so I was looking at there's this huge art prize in Australia called the Archibald, and it's Australia's most famous art prize for portraiture. And I was looking at the last few years and I was really taken by this artist called Cherry Hood, who did these beautiful, very tender, very angsty portraits that looked like it was in oil paint, but it looked like watercolor. So it was washes and it looked like the subject was crying or melting. And I'm a teenager, so I'm like, totally, that's right up my alley. And one particular painting of this pianist who's right there. and and so I sort of I did
I love
I
that.
made
It's so timely. It's like
I know, right?
practice it.
He picks his timing well. And so that was my biggest inspiration. And I did all of these portraits of my little brother at the time. And so I put that in the back of my mind. I'm 17, whatever. And my life goes on. And when I'm 25, I joined this Facebook art appreciation
Mm.
group. So I don't know if they still have groups, but kind of groups on
They do,
Facebook. I
yeah.
think they do, yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a while since
I know, right?
um but I joined this art appreciation group and then I started posting my own paintings because I had just gone full time as an artist. So 25 is when I went full time as an artist. I get a DM at one point from this guy who says, I really love your work. And we started talking about it. And his favorite painting was actually of my boyfriend at the time. So I had a boyfriend at the time. he's like, "Oh, you guys should come to a gig sometime." I'm like, "All right, who's this random guy asking me to go to a gig?" The gig, it turns out, was a huge, very epic concert recital at City Recital Hall, one of the biggest kind of classical music venues. And I'd never been to a classical music concert ever. So we attend this concert, and it's this mind-blowing of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, which is this like
Yeah, yeah.
incredible piece of music. So time passes, and I leave my boyfriend, and I start seeing this pianist. And it really takes me until we're seeing each other to be like, hang on a second. Because the portrait that I studied, it didn't have his name. It just had a title. So Unplugged, was what I knew it by. But it took that long for me to realize that the portrait that I had studied and based my entire major work on, was of him. I was like, wow, that's a strange sort of predestined thing that you inspired me then. And then I shortly after did a painting of him, and it was, yeah, and that's never stopped. The rest is history because I still paint him to this day.
That's a beautiful story. Yeah, I saw, I think, some of your recent works, and it's also related to like this everyday postures and like a
Yes.
light and how it like interacts with one another. And do you have some artists, probably like I know some of the living artists now that you're also inspired by, where you go to look for?
I have lots of favorites. My favorite artists aren't, I don't look to them for technique. I look to them to remind me what art is capable of. And they're quite different from me. One of them is sort of more similar, and that's Eric Fischl. So he's an American artist, and he's been around for the last 40 years, but he makes these incredible, almost collage-like, um, would you call them realist? It's a sort of realist style, a more traditional sort of painter. But he has this really twisted sense of humor, and he kind of juxtaposes different settings that are confronting sometimes. Sort of the narratives. I like artists who have a strong sense of narrative about their work. Yeah, so I love his work. There's another called Izzy Wood, who's a young contemporary artist from the UK, and she is just so inspirational as an all-rounder artist, because again she has this really cool sense of humor about her painting. She just paints her everyday life. They're very unpretentious work, deliberately sort of unpolished. She's just really unapologetic about herself. And uh and I recently went to London actually for my own show, and I saw her work at the Tate, no, National Portrait Gallery, one of them. And I was just like, just blown away by the simplicity of it. So for someone so young, and she's also a musician, and she's also published writing, like it's just like all over the place. And I think at the top of sort of my favorite contemporary artists is an American called Jordan Wolfson. And this guy, I think I honestly don't even have words to describe. So he creates sculptural robotic pieces. So kinetic sculptures, again, are really twisted. They're funny. So one that you would probably have seen. So there's a female figure. It's life size. It looks like a real woman from behind. And she is in front of a mirror, and there's sort of the mechanism of the piece is there's this metal rod that is sticking out of the wall into her chest. And it looks like she's been impaled. And she's kind of dancing in front of herself. And
Mm.
she's this like really, the body is this really sexy woman,
Mm.
robot, dressed sort of scantily clothed. And her face looks like a witch, like with a hook nose and like creepy eyes. And she's singing along to the music. And it's just the most like bonkers, fucked up, hilarious, confronting, amazing, like mesmerizing thing. So yeah, Jordan Wolfson, amazing.
I was about to say, I was like, that sounds so mesmerizing. I know how did I miss it, but it sounds so good. And do you have like a favorite contemporary museums that you like to go in Sydney, or like, I know, like classical or
Yeah.
you know?
I think for me, I love the Art Gallery of New South Wales. So that's sort of my local big gallery. And that was the first ever gallery I ever went to.
Mm.
Um, and I just have such special, special memories of that place. Because it was the first time. So I saw art for the first time when I was 11, and my dad took me. And I remember just being drawn to like the smell. You know, when you just smell old paintings,
Yeah.
that sort of old linseed oil, it's sort of like makes your head spin. And I remember just kind of floating into this one room of sort of 19th century paintings. And I was confronted by this enormous portrait of two men on a raft, and they look like corpses. And I was just like standing in front of this giant painting, and the smell was hitting me, and it was terrifying, but I was like so compelled by it. And I nearly touched it until, because I didn't realize you couldn't touch the paintings. And this guard who was watching me was like, no touching. And it just completely cut off that like fantasy. But I will never ever forget that, because I think that was the moment the seed was planted that I don't know what it is, but I have to do that. I have to be there. And then shortly after, I was also in that Archibald Prize that I mentioned. And that's in that gallery, that's in that museum. So I have been exhibited in that museum a few times now, in that same space where my husband's portrait was hung and won the prize, and the same place where I first saw that first artwork that really got under my skin. So, yeah.
That's fascinating. And you already have like artworks that in the museum. And how about like sort of like long-term vision, in the many, many years, where you ideally like see your artworks? Is it like museum, gallery, just like admires walls or
All of that, I think. I think the key is just longevity. I would love a career that has longevity, because many artists will know that burnouts are inevitable. It just comes and it hits you when you least expect it, when you don't want it to be there, because you want to feel invincible, you know. But I want to be able to go through burnouts and recover and get back up and keep making again, because ultimately it just gives me so much meaning, I think. And the fact that people actually want to buy it is wild. Like that will never not be crazy to me, because it's so personal and it's so subjective. And the fact that other people can resonate with something so subjective, so personal to you, it's a fragment of my soul, and they would like to possess it. And I never feel so connected and disconnected at the same time as the moment where I sell a painting, I give a painting to someone to keep forever. Um,
yeah, it does sound like a moment of like a true connection. So I assume you meet like, most of the people, I guess, or like a good amount of people who get your work.
no, I
Oh,
don't. I
you
really
don't.
don't. It's mostly
Gallery.
online. It's my galleries overseas, even my galleries in Australia. I don't meet the actual buyer. I think I've only met maybe 10 in
Hmm.
person. Sometimes they'll email me on Instagram, and that's the greatest thing, because I'm just like, I just want to give them a big hug and just sort of, I don't know, it's like, thank you for buying my depression from 2017. Enjoy. Like, I'm glad that it can give you, I'm glad that I can make beautiful things out of darkness.
Art. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how often, because I was curious, that's why I was asking, when you give to someone the artwork, how often there's this they see the same feeling or emotion that you try to capture, or does it usually like a different from what you try to capture and everyone see their own?
I think both. I think the thing that surprises me every time is that by the time I'm actually already painting something, I've already moved on from whatever emotion is being translated. So I feel already a distance from myself. So I never expect certain emotions to come out. And then I'll get a comment, or I'll get, a buyer who's reached out and said, I was really captivated by the sadness or the something. And I'm like, I was really happy when I painted that. Like, I can't actually paint when I'm sad, because when you're sad, you just want to lie down and eat some ice cream, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to paint. The painting never lies. I think that's what every time it just amazes me how revealing it is. It's like a lie detector test. You cannot lie. You can't hide. It's so exposing. And that constant state of vulnerability that you have to be in, that's really where the burnout comes from, because you have to keep mining in yourself, unless you're making sort of work that's a little bit more, a little less intense, I suppose. Yeah.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And when you have this like dark moments or some sort of like struggles, how do you, because I feel like everyone has like different practices, how do you
Mm.
find the way out of it? Like, do you just let yourself live in this emotion, or do you,
Well,
how,
you mentioned meditation before, which is a huge, huge part of my life now. I've been, I started during the pandemic, which was a really sort of turning point for me, I think, as a person and as an artist. Um, Time is a huge factor, time and just mindfulness of letting yourself feel something, but also recognizing that it's a temporary feeling, recognizing that you will soon enter into another feeling. And I think just honoring each emotion as it comes and not thinking about anything as particularly bad, even if it hurts. It's not necessarily bad. I don't have to suffer or struggle with it. I just have to accept that this is something that my body is trying to tell me that I am hurting, and I need to listen to that and I need to respond to that. And once I've processed all of that, that's when I can actually make art from it. Because usually when it's too raw, it hasn't gone through the filters of what I need to say about it, because I don't yet know what to say about it. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
you need the time to process everything and to go through, I suppose, like the cycle of grief, and to get to the stage where you can actually be creative from it.
That sounds like a healing process. Well, it's a bit off-topic question, but if you say have like unlimited funds, right? So
Yeah.
is there an artwork or sculpture of a living artist or already artist way that you'd love to, to have?
I have such a dark, dark answer for that one. I saw it very recently in the flesh for the first time. So I went to Spain. I went to Madrid, and I went to the Prado Museum. And the one painting that just, I actually just cried when I entered the room, because I had studied it, I had analyzed it for so many years, and seeing it in person, I just, yeah, I was just weeping. And that's Goya's Saturn devouring his son.
It's a
It's an
story.
incredibly confronting, it's a painting.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly confronting painting of this god, essentially, Cronus, eating a body. He's eating his child, which is a human, like a fully grown man, but part of the limbs have been eaten off. So it has one leg, it has no head, it has no arms. It's a really, really confronting painting. But the two things that I just was so, it's like magic to me. Firstly, how loosely and how quickly he seems to have painted it. It's nothing is labored over. Everything is just sort of just worked on enough to give it form that's recognizable. And secondly, is the emotion of Saturn. As he is eating his own child, there is this intense sadness and shame and a kind of like compulsion. You can see five different emotions as he is doing this completely abhorrent thing. And he is feeling shame at the same time, but he can't help himself. So it's just like when I saw it, I just, the chills, my whole body was covered in goosebumps, because I was like, oh my God, like there it is. Yes, I'll buy that. I won't
Go is a good
I
choice.
won't hang it. I won't hang it in my bedroom, but I'll maybe like I'll hang it in my studio.
Oh my. What about your shows? Do you have like maybe like an idea where you like, okay, I'd love to have show in the city or like collaborate with the gallery?
Yeah, I mean, I have an enormous list. Think of every gallery, like to be in MoMA, to be in any. I mean, it in a way, I've stopped thinking about milestones like that. Like when you asked me earlier about sort of what I my wish for myself,
Mhm.
it's really, when you win an art prize or you get picked up by a gallery or whatever, you make a sale, the high is so brief. it is such a brief and temporary high. You just like, oh, I've achieved that thing that's sort of measurable to the outside world, but it doesn't give me the same electric feeling as the excitement of starting a new painting or the excitement of opening my eyes and I am already in the process of a painting, waking up knowing that I get to do this again every day. Yeah. So regardless of which gallery, who knows, be in when I'm older. I'd love, I have a projection of myself as like an 80-year-old and having like a retrospective at somewhere like MoMA. That would
I
be
was to say, I was like, I can
incredible.
see it in MoMA easily. Retrospective. And it was so, and perhaps that one of my like last questions is that what would you say keep you going like every day, like combining this artistic life and everyday life? And
It's a really poignant question for me at the moment. I think because I've been thinking about it a lot, especially with being injured and not being able to paint, because my right arm, so my painting arm, would go numb. So I literally wouldn't be able, or I'd get shooting pains in my hand because the injury is in my neck. So the thing that keeps me going is knowing what it felt like to not have it,
hmm.
knowing what it felt like to not be able to paint and how much I suffered as a human being to not be able to express myself and just remembering what a privilege it is because I think about there's only one artist that I know of in my family and that's my dad's younger brother
Hmm.
and I remember visiting him in my early 20s and he lives in this unbelievable house, or he used to live in this unbelievable house that looks like it was built out of the plans drawn by a 5-year-old. Like it's like everything was completely topsy-turvy and sort of nothing was the right height or depth. Um, but he was living in all of this art and he's a really severe alcoholic. And that really got in the way of him thriving as an artist.
Hmm.
So I think a lot about what prevents me from continuing to be an artist. And essentially it's like looking after your body, looking after your mind, looking after your spirit. Art really is it's so interwoven with my life and my everything about it. It's like you can't really separate like, oh, let's take away you being an artist now. It's completely interwoven. Everything is built around it and it is built around everything. So I have totally lost track of the question.
No, you actually did. I think that you captured. I so get you. By the way, I feel like we're so in the same way that like, everything you're talking about, I'm like, I know what she's talking
As
about.
long as it makes sense to you,
It
that's
really
enough.
does.
That's all I need.